Welcome to Thinking Christian about faith, life, and culture. I'm Grady King with Church Resources at Oklahoma Christian, and I also am the co-leader of Hope Network Ministries. So today we have two special guests with us today, and they are Dr. Ron Bruner at Westview Boys Home in Hollis, Oklahoma, and Dr. Dudley Chancey, who teaches youth and family ministry, Gen Ed Bible, and is just a wonderful person to talk about this subject today. Ron and Dudley, welcome. Glad you're here.
Thank you, Grady.
Yeah, the subject is a compelling title: B to Z Faith. Baby boomers exploring faith with Gen Z. Wow. You know, I think of the song years ago in the 80s by a group called Mike and the Mechanics, called The Living Years. And it was about a boy coming to grips with his father before he died, or after he died, wishing he would spend some time with him, and they would have connected more from generation to generation. And I know that the song starts, every generation blames the one before, and all their fears and frustration come knocking on their door. Of course, Cat Stevens has Cats in the Cradle and all those songs, but the reality is it true that every generation kind of blames the one before, and there's just natural tension? So how do we talk about that in regards to faith, from B to Z faith? What'd you have in mind there? Who wants to dive in?
I think that boomers have turned the tables on that. We're blaming the generations that follow after us for the mess that the world is in.
Wow.
And so I think that that's a really inappropriate way to enter into conversations with other generations. And I think that's one of the ways that we've tended to shoot ourselves in the feet in our dealings with the younger generations, is this presumption that we've got it right and they're wrong, which has closed off some conversations right up front.
Wow, that's so just the way we frame that makes a difference. Dudley, what's your take on that?
Well, when I think about blame, I usually, when something's going wrong or whatever, I just say, thank you, Adam. I mean, if we're going to blame things, we got to go all the way back. That's the world's jacked up, and you don't get anywhere blaming people anyway. That's a human thing. We just got to have somebody, it's not my fault, it's yours. So I think that's just part of human nature.
So this idea of baby boomers exploring faith with Gen Z, what are the things that factor into that, and why is that so important? Are you hearing this in churches a lot, that people are frustrated? We can't reach our young people. We're losing our young people. What's going on here? Is that help us understand kind of the context of why this is an important subject?
I think that part of the problem is that older generations are frustrated with their ability to download a certain given faith to a younger generation. Here it is. We figured it all out. We've packaged it up for you. Take it and go do this thing. And so that's one of the reasons that we wanted the title to be Exploring Faith with the Younger Generation. And that is that download thing is a bad metaphor and a bad practice. And so actually what we really want to do is explore faith together with these younger generations, to talk about these questions together, and without always hauling out our presumed answers too fast.
So it sounds like what I'm hearing is it'd be good to lead with listening rather than telling. How do you engage them then? You know?
I think one of the reasons we're doing this session is some work that Ron and I have started in the Intergenerational Faith Center, our second major study, if you will, about grandparents. And we've been intrigued by how do you skip a generation? How to, looking back, even Israel in the Old Testament, they were faithful, they were not faithful, they were faithful, they were not faithful, they were not faithful a long time. You know, that you can look at the kings, and this one served God with all his heart, this one did evil in God's eye. You know, even the next generation, sometimes after Josiah, one of the great ones, how do you lose it? What happens? And so in this research study that we're putting together, we've already done a lit review of over 50 books written on grandparents, 250 research articles. And what we've been looking for in the literature is how do you transmit your faith not only to your children, the next generation, but the next generation. Because if the Bible is true, and we're going to go with that, we are, the older are to teach the younger. And it never, discipleship doesn't end with retirement. It ends in death, your death. But we're not doing that. At least many are not doing that. And we think there's a tie into the whole reason why we should be exploring together the faith of our grandchildren. All three of us are very great and proud and whatever grandparents. And I got a feeling you two feel the same way as I do. I want my grandchildren to grow up knowing Jesus.
Yes,
And
very much so.
so this study that we're going to do is hopefully we'll get into how does this not happen? Why are we even talking about this right now?
And I think Psalm 78 gives us part of the answers to this. So it's a reminder to keep telling your children and their children about God, and it's a warning about what happens when you don't, because here are these people who have again and again lived through history with God, and in the moment didn't connect God's presence in their lives with how they were telling the story of their life. And so I think that's one of the ways that we don't do well now. And based on some of the things that Dudley has unearthed in his literature review, is that we're not telling our stories at all. You know, we've kind of got a historic tendency not to do that anyway, you know, because of the word testimony. And so,
yeah, that's true.
But actually, we have an obligation to tell those stories. Our children and our grandchildren should know the story of how we became Christians. Why did we do that? How did that happen? How has faith unwrapped itself through the course of our life? And so that's the warning from Psalm 78, is not to forget to tell.
Don't forget to tell.
Grady, in 2005, when Christian Smith did the landmark study of churched teenagers soul searching, you know, the number one finding that they found was that teenagers could not articulate their faith. They couldn't tell their story. The Lilly Foundation gave them $3 million more, and they went and studied the parents of those same teenagers. And their number one finding was they couldn't articulate their faith either. And so through these years, we have not learned how to talk about, to tell about my faith story. And part of that is what Dr. Bruner said about, at least in our fellowship, we shied away from anybody standing up and telling what God's done in their life. And yet what we're finding is that's the very thing, and maybe the pivotal thing, that we as grandparents and parents need to be telling our children and grandchildren is what God has done in my life. What did I do in 2020 when this COVID virus shut the world down?
Right.
How did God, how was he my stronghold in that time? How did I trust in God to get through that? As well as the Great Depression and whatever else that's going to come along till God comes back. How does God sustain me through that? Our kids, they need to hear that, and they're not hearing that. Dr. Amanda Drury has a book called Saying is Believing, and it's her study of adolescents being able to talk God talk and talk their faith, tell their faith story. And in kids that's not happening, but like the ones that Christian Smith studied, if you're not able to articulate that, it's probably not even happening in your life. And so when we get down to things grandparents can do, as well as parents later on in this session, that's going to be a key thing, telling your story.
So this study, you've done a lit review of 50 books. What is the next kind of some qualitative or quantitative surveys? Is that what you're headed toward next?
Yeah, what Ron and I want to do is literally do some qualitative interviews. A deal called grounded theory comes out of that. You actually get themes that emerge
Right.
that allow you then, what we want to do from those themes is build an internet survey, basically, where we can survey thousands of grandparents, because we want to do a Christian sample, a Jewish sample, and I want to do a Muslim sample. I'm studying the Bible right now with a Muslim guy, and I am so intrigued when he tells me that every Friday at 2:00, his grandfather, his father, him, and his nephews all go to mosque together.
Wow.
And although he's studying the Bible with me and he's very intrigued with this Jesus thing, he's 22. He's been going to mosque. He can't remember when he did not go to mosque. And we've lost that in Protestant and even Catholic type religion. We've lost it.
So I'm thinking here, maybe both of you could respond to this. I'm thinking in terms of the way that our youth ministries and our churches are designed. They're isolated parachurch. I mean, there's got to be parachurch organizations. I mean, it's like, we've modeled our whole our church educational system after a public school system. It's all segmented: first grade, second grade, third grade, preschool, youth. And I'm wondering if I'm a youth minister hearing this, and I'm thinking, wow, what could I do to create this environment of sharing faith more and hearing the stories for the next generation, from the next generation? What are some practical suggestions you might think about? While you're thinking there, I'm remembering as a youth minister, one of the favorite times of the year is when I would take the kids on a Sunday evening as a youth minister, and I would take them to some of our older members' homes. And, they were always so kind and gracious. And I just asked them to tell their faith story. And the kids were just fascinated by these people they see at church that are older, and some of the things they went through and conquered. And they're saying, God's faithful. God will take care of you, And so, do you have any other suggestions? I mean, I'm a youth minister. Listen to this. If you're one of those, what do you do in a youth ministry to facilitate the kind of dynamic you're talking about?
I think that the youth ministers are doing a number of things. One of those is their service projects very often have interactions with older members of the church. Back in the old days, when I was a youth minister, we used to have a high school lunch where we were hosted by different members of the congregation, often older people.
Yes.
And another case where the older members of the church became encouragers of the younger church by writing handwritten notes to those kids and developing individual relationships, which over the years flourished into something that lasted longer than those kids being there at that particular time.
Right. Good stuff.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of the sticky faith research out of Fuller. Their idea, in which, if you really go back to the 80s, there were several guys, Merton Strawman and Raleigh Martinson, that talked about intergenerational, instead of these silos that we have formed. How do you keep your church intergenerational, and how do you connect at least 4 or 5 adult people to each teenager in your church? And the research points out the more people that do that, the more likely that teenager will become, as a college student, as an adult, and stay faithful in the church. I think that's good to think about, but I will still say this: it's still the parents are the number one influence. If the parents don't model it, if it's not important to the parents, it will not be important to the kids.
Oh man, that's powerful right there, and the research bears that out through the years.
Yeah.
Good. So what other ideas do you have, or concepts that we need to grab a hold of and think about when we're talking about B to Z and exploring faith?
Some years ago, Dudley and I were co-teaching a class where we had the class members do individual projects in their home congregation. And at the time, Kinnaman had just come out with his work that talked about one of the things younger people were struggling with was doubt. And so this particular youth minister had his entire congregation take a survey about doubt. Had they ever experienced it? When did they experience it? What did it feel like? And so what they found is that the younger people in the church were much more inclined to have experienced doubt and talk about it. And it really jolted some of the older people in the church that the kids were actually struggling with doubt. Their kids, not some kids in the survey.
Right.
And so the minister preached a series of sermons about it, and they talked through, and they actually had conversations where it came out that, well, yeah, everybody has experienced doubt. Part of that is the story that we tell about that. Are we going to tell the story in an edited way that cuts out all the tough parts? Or are we going to be able to tell the story in a way that talks about the problems we've had too? And those, that kind of storytelling interaction about real faith stuff helps those intergenerational relationships, because that was one of the net outcomes in that little intervention that the youth minister did over that 3-month period.
Wow.
So sometimes it's not a big thing. It's the beginning of a conversation that we can build on. That's where we need to start.
Wow. Dudley, got anything to add to that?
Grady, I had breakfast yesterday with a gentleman that he funded the Intergenerational Faith Center. And so Ron and I try to meet with him 2 or 3 times a year. And it just worked out yesterday to have breakfast with him. And he is a great grandfather. And I was just throwing questions at him and listening to him. And I said, you know, if you had to think of one thing that can help us with this, how do we pass our faith on and stuff like that? And he, you know, I was expecting this really great answer from him. And he just looked at me, he just said, stick to it. And I said, what do you mean stick to it? And he said, you keep going to church, you keep modeling, you keep telling your kids and your grandkids and your great grandkids about what God's done. He said, you do what you know is right, and you don't quit doing it just because COVID happened or just because it's raining outside, or just you keep your nose to the grindstone thing. The second thing that's interesting that I've been finding in this literature about grandparenting, and there's a new term that's called gray divorce.
Wow.
And we're living longer, our spouses are living longer, and what's happening is, you know, I'm real old, and I've been married to Vicky for a long time, and when I look at it, according to statistics, I could live 30 more years. And what's happening is, especially guys are looking at this and going, man, I don't like you anymore. I'm going to go get me somebody else or whatever. And so there's more and more divorce happening with people my age. I'm saying that to say, if you ask me, what could we be doing to help our grandchildren? And I tell young parents this: stay married. You work on your marriage. If I had something to tell churches and tell elders and tell ministers, you figure out how to help young couples work on their marriage. And now I would say you figure out how to get grandpa and granny back there in the pew, how to get them to not have this gray divorce thing. What can they do? I mean, one of the questions you asked on a piece of paper I saw was what can these grandparents or what can people be doing? We know that baby boomers, of which I think at least 2 of us here are, you may be also, Grady, you might have caught that last, but we're actually, the research shows we're volunteering less because baby boomers don't like menial jobs of stuffing envelopes as volunteering. We want to use our skills that we've developed for 40 years to help the kingdom to help. So when your church comes and says, hey, mow the grass, I'd rather them come and say, hey, could you help us put a network together to connect teenagers with our old folks something that has some meat to it. So that's another thing. And then a third thing that I would say is, from the research, think about this: 3 generations, grandparents, parents, and grandchildren. The parents in the middle are what's called the gatekeeper. And they are the ones that control whether your grandparent can get to your grandchild. If there's a bad relationship with grandparent and parent, somebody needs to suck it up and mend that, do some fence mending, because that's going to matter about your relationship with your grandchildren. If this one's bad right here in the middle, I'm never going to be able to tell those grandchildren about Jesus as much as I want to, because they're not going to let me get to them for whatever reason. There's a new book out called Women Rowing North by Mary Pipher. She's the one that wrote Reviving Ophelia, and she wrote several elderly books that I've used in my gerontology classes. But this Women Rowing North is how do you finish strong in these later years? And there's actually a chapter in there about grandparenting that it's full of regrets that grandparents have because of how they treated their children, which probably influenced their children to be or not be churchy. And so there could be some great, you got 30 more years. I need to have a good relationship with my kids so that I can have a good relationship with my grandkids. So I would say those kind of things are important to think about. And churches it would behoove elders to figure out, okay, we got youth ministry. We're probably knocking that one out of the park pretty much. And we got all these senior people that we do great funerals for or whatever. But if I got 30 more years to live in my church, I want to be productive.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you're talking about relationships. So you got your own relationship with God and how you share that story, and your own relationship with, love God, love neighbor, with your own family, and how you work through those things and what really matters. And you shared some really good resources. And so if you're listening to this, then you will receive the books he's been talking about, the links to those, or where you can find those, the name of the books. We'll make sure everyone gets those. Ron, you have any? We got about 4 or 5 minutes left, but Dudley just kind of brought it all together in some practical ways. So what would you add to that?
I'd say that we, especially in this relationship with the middle generation, the gatekeepers, need to remember the power of being confessional. When my kids hit their 20s, one of the first things I did was apologize for the way that I had raised them. I apologized for the mistakes that I made and the fact that they were my learning experience. And so I've also been confessional since then, because in Dudley and my studies, we've learned a lot more about parenting than we ever knew when we actually had kids in the home with us. And so I'm able to offer some things for them to consider, but it's always with the confession that I wish I had known this when I was your age. But at the same time, to remember that parenting is different for them, the context is different for them, and that we need to allow them to have scope there to do what they think is right as a parent. I'm fiercely proud of my kids and how they're parenting my grandkids, and I don't want to get in the middle of that. So being confessional and keeping that relationship healthy with conversation, I'd say, Grady, is the key thing. And then it's easier to have the easy relationship with the grandkids. That's not a problem for us at all, really.
Well, I've heard confessional, relationship with kids, the concept of gatekeeper, sharing your faith. I mean, it's all pretty basic stuff that we've kind of taken for granted. It seems very important going forward, because, boy, the world has changed, and we're living in such a different time than the three of us were raised. And it's a challenge. And so I think it's good to be reminded of the basics. So I know we've said this in different ways, but if each of you could just share 1 or 2 just real nuggets here as we close about, so what? So I'm a Bible class teacher, I'm a youth minister, I'm an elder, I'm a teacher, a preacher at a church. trying to shepherd, lead God's people. What are the nuggets from this conversation about exploring faith with Gen Z and baby boomers? What would you say going away?
Well, I would add in all of this thing prayer. I mean, I hope we believe in it, and I would also say, as a grandparent, I pray more for my 3 granddaughters than I think I ever did for my children, because I knew I was raising them perfect, my children. Now my children are raising my grandchildren. They need a lot of prayer, but just like you said, the world we live in, the concerns we live in, and why would you bring a kid into this world kind of thing? And yet they are a wonderful, truly wonderful gift from God, and I enjoy every day we're with them. So I would say, the prayer thing is a big deal. And then just, if I was to tell elders to do one thing this coming Sunday, I would say go to the classes of the young marrieds and tell them, if they don't start reading their Bible and praying at home with their kids will not be in church in 20 years. Guarantee it. I guarantee it. And so the studies, you can go click on anything about baby boomers right now and the next millennials and Gen Z, and the millennials and Gen Zs that are not in church. Every time it's ones that there was not prayer and Bible reading in their home. And a lot of the millennials went to church, but 42% are only going now. And the ones in the 48% that and this is a couple of studies that were done last year, those people did not have that in their home. They kind of went to church once or twice, but once again, if it's not important to you, it's not going to be important to them. So modeling, but doing it. And I think that's, you don't have to be a rocket science to say a prayer and read a scripture at your house. It just says, guys, this is important. We're doing it every day.
Wow. Thank you, Dudley.
You
Ron,
don't have to do a devotional.
what's your parting word?
Nostalgia never gets you anywhere.
I just said that. That's awesome.
Only hope takes you into the future. And what we need to do is find out what our kids and our grandkids are hoping for and learn how to hope along with them for that new future, because their world's going to be different. That's just a fact. Now we need to let them help us deal with this new world by leading us into a future that can be very much where God is busy and active in the world around us.
Wow, that's really good stuff. I love stuff about nostalgia. I've been reading about that in a book called Quietly Courageous by Gil Rendell, and he talks about nostalgia is work avoidance. Nostalgia is work avoidance. We don't want to do the work for the present and the future because we're so consumed with nostalgia, and that's really true. Boy, guys, thank you very much for being a part of this.
Let me give you one more book to put on that Bridget can put on the bibliography. It's called Aging. It's fresh out by Willimon of Duke University,
Right.
And how to age good in the church and have purpose and all that. So it's a great book for all 3 of us to read and others, because it gives you, I think one of the things you lose after retirement is purpose. And there's so stinking much to be done in the church that you'd have to get another job to take a break from it. What we could be doing and volunteering.
Boy, that's
in
good
our
stuff.
churches.
Guys, thank you so much for your ministry and what you're doing. And we'll probably have another one of these in the future. And this has been the webinar, Thinking Christian About Faith, Life, and Culture. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. Have a great day.
Blessings to you, Grady.
Blessings.